recommending. Okay, I'll go ahead and introduce Hardam Tripathi then. He is a member of the Executive Committee of ICHRRF, and his talk will be on legal issues in genocides. Hardam Tripathi is a US Immigration and Nationality Law Attorney, admitted to practice in immigration court as an advocate and counselor in all 50 states in the Union via federal jurisdiction. Prior to launching his own law firm, Tripathi served as a management consultant with a Big Four firm representing clients in matters related to strategic risk, intelligence, and a bunch of other things. I'm not going to get into that. He's worked for various other small and mid-sized firms in Florida, providing regulatory and policy advice to aid clients effectively navigate federal and state government programs. I'm going to stop over there. I'm going to hand it over to Hardam. Go for it.
Hey, how's everyone doing today? I'm Attorney Tripathi. I just want to say thank you for having me. I know we're a little short on time, so I'm going to try to get through these slides as quick as possible, or I'm just going to just jump right into the issue, let you know what the legal issues are within the realm of genocide. I think Mr. Sir did a wonderful job at kind of going over the intent aspect of things. He went over kind of what the 5 parameters are to prove that something is genocide. So I'm just going to jump right in, just hit the meat and potatoes of it, and just kind of get us all here and stay on time. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, sir. Thank you. All right, so we already understand the legal framework. The challenges, though, how do you prove that the atrocity was genocide? When you look, we've had a wonderful day-to-day kind of understanding the different types of genocides, what happens, but when all that's said and done, now it goes into a court, an international court at that. What's next? Like, what are the issues that international communities, the states, specifically like the countries, what issues do they see? And ultimately, what are the legal issues that do arise when you're dealing with different sovereign nations who have their own laws from a state perspective, but then also from an international perspective? And then what are the actual specific legal issues that occur when you're actually looking at the intent, when you're looking at, which we'll go into, the specific intent, which they call it dolus specialis. Think of it as kind of like mens rea, which is kind of I'll break it down real simple. You could have thoughts in your head all day of wanting to murder someone, right? And that could be your thought. You have the mens rea, right? But you may now act on it. So that's the actus rea, right? So you don't act on it. So hence, by legal definition, you've not committed murder. At the same time, you might commit the murder physically, but you may not have had the specific intent to actually commit murder. And what I mean by that is you could be driving on the street here and doing everything properly, and someone could dart out right in front of you, and you might run them over, and you didn't have the intent to run that person over, however, you did run that person over. So now is that considered murder or involuntary manslaughter? So these are the different kind of issues that you kind of see, and I just use that example just to kind of prove a complex point of specific intent. And I think Mr. Seward actually went over intent, kind of gave a really great example of Islam and kind of what Pakistan's doing and how we prove that intent. So I'm not really going to dive too much into kind of what it is, but yes, these are all the various criminal tribunals that are involved. International criminal courts are involved, international courts of justice are involved. These are all various avenues that have jurisdiction over these types of cases based on international law and genocide laws particularly. Next slide, please. All right, so what I'm going to do here is, instead of going through all these slides, because there could be a whole seminar on just the legal issues ultimately in genocide areas. So I'm just going to jump right in, right? We've already talked about the intent requirement. We understand that genocide does require specific intent to prove in a court of law, and that intent can be very difficult in a legal context, because what will end up happening is that when you have mass violence going on in different parts of the world, there's multiple factors associated with it, and then the prosecutors have to basically prove their legal burden in a court of law, international court of law, to ultimately look at, okay, what was the intent of this specific group? And like that trickle, that drip, 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 which is what I really like, it takes time, right? How do you prove that something happened, all at once, or maybe it happened over a span of many, many years, especially covering various national, ethnic, racial, religious, various different protected grounds, right? And if you look at, even looking at asylum in general, but looking at it from a genocide perspective, you really see that there's a membership of a particular social group, or there's persecution based on race or religion or nationality or political opinion. These could all be various factors that the court will take into play, along with the prosecutor doing their job and then the defense attorney he or she doing their job. So these are just overall, these are kind of the issues that you'll see is the intent requirement is going to be very hard to prove. Because it's not like a smoking gun. You're not going to have something like hard evidence right there. Sometimes, which we'll talk about chain of command, a lot of these bad acts are done by people who are in higher levels of power, and through a chain of command, the actual acts themselves, the actual rapes or the murders or the forced trafficking of people, this is actually done by usually state and local actors at the local level, even though they're being told at the higher level what to do. So that's how they prove that specific intent, that mens rea. It's proven by actually looking at communications between different actors within those governments or within those states. And so it's just very difficult to prove. There was actually a really landmark case called Croatia v. Serbia that kind of highlighted all the factors that goes into play. I wish I had time to kind of go over that case in kind of a nutshell, but basically, long story short, there's like 4 different elements you have to prove. It's kind of the slide was actually shared by Mr. Sir a little bit ago on another case, but it was that same level of, okay, there was an alleged incident that occurred. These were the actual facts that occurred. This caused the actual issues, and then there was irreparable harm done. So it's basically like a legal process that they use. Now I'm going to go into another issue you get in this type of realm. It's basically looking at state responsibility versus the individual or the criminal responsibility. So you got to look at, based on international law, you got to look at what did the state do, right? What was their role in this? Basically, the state's supposed to hold each individual accountable, but what if the state is the bad actor, right? So you run into those issues, and then you have individual accountability as well, which the ICC will take care of at that point. But you have to look at the international mandate versus what that domestic mandate is, and then the international, they have the right to basically uphold these laws so that further genocides don't occur. Now, how do you prove the genocide in court? I quickly talked about that. These are legal issues that will come up. You have to have your burden of proof. Basically, you have to establish, and there's various factors, of course, and we can have a whole thing on this all day, but I'll make it quick. You have to have genocidal intent. That's like one of the biggest intent elements that you need. You also need to show that the scope of the crimes have substantial evidence that's backed up. So it's basically, it's not just as simple as, hey, this happened. You have to prove every single element. So it makes genocide cases very complex and hard to prove. I mean, once everything happens, we all know it happened technically, but in a court of law, everything is run by evidence, and you need to have evidentiary standards that are met at the highest level of the law. So you definitely have to prove those standards in those criminal tribunals by looking at the elements and applying the law to the set of facts. And then do your analysis, and you end up with the conclusion. That's what these parties will do, these attorneys. Then you have a whole threshold where it's in whole versus part. We're not going to have time to probably go into that, but basically it's a debate about what was the intent at the time. Did you actually intend to wipe out or completely remove that specific protected group, or was it just a substantial part of that? Did it rise to the level to meet that burden? Basically, was there enough of damage that had occurred that actually took advantage of it being a genocidal act? Because yes, it started substantial, but the legal impact of it created overall this protected class to be obviously persecuted. Then there's also issues that you're going to see involving jurisdiction. A lot of countries will play the whole jurisdictional game, where they'll argue that if they're a sovereign, that they're not a party to the convention. So then they'll argue saying that there's also going to be like political considerations that'll probably be met. You're also going to see a lot of diplomats and diplomatic community get involved, where now you're dealing with geopolitics and you're looking at what's good for the country, for that specific country. So you deal with geopolitics, you deal with diplomatic community issues. Then you also have ICC jurisdiction being an issue as well. It does derive from the Rome Statute, as we all know, but basically a lot of members that aren't part of that convention or that statute, or unless the Security Council refers the case, but if they're not party to that, they'll just say, oh, we're not a party to it. So then how do you prosecute someone if you're not even a member of that engagement, right? So basically at the end of the day, each country is sovereign. So that's like the biggest issue you see. Then you also have, and I'm almost done here, but basically you have genocidal acts versus other crimes that could occur. There's a lot of crimes against humanity. There's a lot of war crimes, but they're not technically under the same definition as genocide as we just saw. So you may have a lot of overlapping of crimes that may not be considered genocide. So defense attorneys will use, well, hey, this was not actually genocide. This was a crime against humanity. Just to kind of, if you kind of see the nature of the beast, kind of what they're doing to kind of point fingers, like it wasn't us, right? It's not genocide. So they'll look at the definition. Finally, you're going to have the state sovereignty and non-intervention issue. You're going to have tensions with sovereignty based on elections that are going on in the country, or based on what's going on around the world, based on what's good for their economics or the well-being of that specific country. You're also going to see what's called failure to prevent. States are going to, that fail to prevent the genocide itself, based on the convention, it may not rise to a certain level of international wrongdoing, even though there was wrongdoing that did occur. So that's like a big distinction. Then you also have cultural genocide, which I really wanted to get into a lot about because I spoke with a few of y'all here. Cultural genocide is huge, right? Because a lot of people nowadays are advocating for this, and this is where, getting involved, talking to your legislature, getting involved in your government, and also international communities and circles. It's very important to advocate. A lot of different things where if there's cultural destruction, if there's destruction of heritage sites, or let's say there's things going on with forced assimilation, the drip, 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 right? Overall, that's through a period of time, there's going to be cultural decimation. When you take away someone's culture, you're literally killing that culture and killing those people, right? Because what one gentleman said, my identity, right? So basically when you do that, well, should the UN maybe expand the definition of what is considered genocide to include cultural genocide as part of their legal prong test that they have to abide by. And then you have things involving impunity, you have enforcement challenges. Even when you do that, there's a lot of political influence going on, there's a lot of lack of enforcement mechanisms in place. It's a bunch of countries obviously together, so you're gonna have a lot of issues trying to enforce the laws that they're supposed to follow. So obviously if they're bad actors, they're probably not going to want to follow the actual court order, and so there's going to be enforcement issues as well. And then finally, just the last point I'll make is you got to look at there's issues in terms of reparations, issues in terms of justice for the victims once the actual case has gone through the legal process. Reparations, they can be challenging, especially when you have states who lack either the political will or they lack the funding, maybe they're indigent, so they don't have the funds to actually give the reparations. Maybe their community or their whole country is in a state of shambles. Maybe there's other wars going on. And then ultimately, the reconciliation, we've talked about that a lot too. Looking at kind of how do you balance all these prosecutions that are going to come out, and how are you going to rebuild societies in the long term so that we learn from our mistakes and it doesn't happen again? Well, you can have a legal mechanism in place, and you can have the reparations and all that in the legal process of dealing with genocide and international law. But then what are you going to do to fix it, right? And these are issues that we as a communities have to come together and talk about, and those who do have the political will are able to pass these laws working with other member states. It starts with like the same thing everyone else has been saying: engagement, advocacy, donate, all these different things. It takes a village. That's what I always tell people. It takes a village. It takes constant advocacy and support. It's not just, hey, let me pick up the phone and call the congressman one time. No, it's let's build those relationships within our communities. And even if we all do that, if I do it here in the United States, if Mr. Kofi G does it over in Africa, it takes a village. It takes multiple countries to work together to ultimately impact change, effectuate change, and ultimately move forward in the right direction when it comes to humanitarian and international law. So thank you very much. I really appreciate y'all, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.